My friends, my brothers and sisters gathered here today, let us pause for a moment in the quiet of our hearts and remember a chapter of history that cries out from the shadows, a story of profound injustice that echoes through the ages. In the vast lands of the Congo, under the iron grip of colonial rule, a darkness descended, not just of exploitation and greed, but of the deepest violation of human dignity. In the heart of Africa, vast and rich with untamed rivers, dense forests, and abundant resources, lay the territory that would become known as the Congo Free State, a domain claimed not by a nation but by one man, King Leopold II of Belgium. In 1885, through cunning diplomacy at the Berlin Conference, Leopold secured international recognition for this immense land, larger than Western Europe itself, as his personal possession, under the guise of a humanitarian mission to civilize and abolish slavery. Yet beneath this veneer of philanthropy lurked a regime of unbridled greed and unimaginable cruelty, one that transformed the Congo into a theater of exploitation where human lives were reduced to mere commodities in the pursuit of profit. Leopold's rule was driven by the booming global demand for rubber, essential for the emerging automobile industry and other modern conveniences. To extract this wealth from the wild rubber vines scattered across the rainforest, he imposed a system of forced labor that ensnared entire villages. Congolese men, women, and children were compelled to harvest quotas of rubber under threat of severe punishment. Failure to meet these impossible targets, often set arbitrarily high to maximize output, resulted in atrocities that shocked the world when finally exposed. The Force Publique, Leopold's private army, composed largely of African soldiers, commanded by European officers, enforced compliance through terror. Villages burned to the ground, hostages taken, and limbs amputated as proof of killings or as direct punishment. Hands were severed from living victims, or the dead collected in baskets to account for expended cartridges. A macabre ledger of brutality that historians estimate contributed to the deaths of millions through direct violence, starvation, disease, and exhaustion. This era, from 1885 to 1908, saw the population of the Congo plummet by as much as half, with estimates ranging from 10 to 15 million lives lost in what many scholars describe as a demographic catastrophe fueled by systematic exploitation. Diseases like sleeping sickness and smallpox spread unchecked amid disrupted communities, while forced labor disrupted farming and hunting, leading to widespread famine. Leopold himself never set foot in the Congo, ruling from afar through concessionary companies that divided the land into profitable fiefdoms, extracting ivory first and then rubber with ruthless efficiency. His personal fortune swelled enormously, funding grand public works in Belgium, palaces, parks, and monuments that stand to this day as ironic testaments to blood-soaked wealth. The exploitative practices extended beyond mere labor extraction into profound violations of human dignity, including widespread sexual violence. Colonial agents isolated in remote posts often took African women as concubines or menagres, relationships marked by stark power imbalances that frequently amounted to coercion or outright rape. These unions, though frowned upon socially and sometimes discouraged by administrators wary of complicating racial hierarchies, produced thousands of mixed-race children. Yet the regime's brutality did not spare women. Reports from missionaries and investigators documented rape as a tool of punishment, extortion, and domination, woven into the fabric of control alongside flogging and mutilation. International outrage grew as accounts filtered out through missionaries, journalists like Edmund Dean Morrill, and consular reports, culminating in the 1904 Casement Report that detailed the horrors. Pressure from the Congo Reform Association forced Leopold to relinquish control in 1908, transferring the territory to the Belgian state as the Belgian Congo. Though some reforms curbed the worst excesses of the Free State era, the underlying structures of exploitation persisted, with forced labor continuing in subtler forms for mining and plantations. The transition marked no clean break from the legacy of Leopold's iron grip. Instead, it entrenched a paternalistic colonial administration that viewed the Congolese as inferior subjects to be managed for Belgium's benefit. This brutal historical context set the stage for even more targeted injustices in the decades that followed. The racial ideology underpinning Leopold's regime, white supremacy justified through pseudoscience and evangelical zeal, evolved into policies that explicitly addressed the problem of mixed-race children, seen as anomalies threatening the rigid binary of colonizer and colonized. Administrators feared these children could form a rebellious intermediary class, drawing parallels to uprisings elsewhere. Thus, from the early 20th century onward, decrees and practices emerged to segregate and control them, often removing them from African mothers to instill European values in state-sponsored or church-run institutions. The Congo, under Belgian influence, became a laboratory of colonial excess, where economic greed intertwined with racial domination to inflict multi-layered suffering. Exploitation stripped the land and its people of autonomy, while violence enforced compliance, leaving scars that reverberated through generations. Sexual violations compounded the trauma, birthing children into a system that rejected them not for who they were, but for the evidence they bore of forbidden crossings. This regime's practices, forced labor, mutilation, hostage-taking, and demographic devastation, laid the foundation for the heart-wrenching separations that would define later colonial policy, ensuring that the grip of empire extended even into the most intimate realms of family and identity. The echoes of this darkness persisted long after Leopold's death in 1909, shaping a colonial order that prioritized profit and purity over humanity, with consequences that demand reckoning even today. In the rigid hierarchy of Belgian colonial rule over the Congo, where white supremacy was enshrined as both law and doctrine, the presence of European men, administrators, officers, settlers, and missionaries, isolated in remote outposts far from the restraints of metropolitan society, created conditions ripe for profound exploitation of African women. Though interracial marriages were formally prohibited and relationships officially discouraged to preserve racial purity, the stark power imbalance ensured that unions between white men and Congolese women were commonplace, often marked by coercion, force, or outright rape. Colonial agents frequently took African women as maïnagres, or housekeepers, who provided domestic labor, companionship, and sexual services in exchange for meager protection or provisions, arrangements that blurred the lines between consent and compulsion in a system where refusal could mean destitution, punishment, or worse. Historical accounts from missionaries, consular reports, and survivors reveal that sexual violence was woven into the fabric of colonial domination. From the earliest days of the Congo Free State under King Leopold through the Belgian Congo era, rape served multiple purposes: as a tool of terror to subdue resistant communities, as extortion to enforce rubber quotas or labor compliance, and as a means to assert white male authority over African bodies. In the rubber regime's brutal enforcement, sentries and officials targeted women in raids, selecting the youngest and most vulnerable for abuse, sometimes forcing incest or public violations to demoralize villages. Women related to men in resistance were particularly singled out, their bodies weaponized to humiliate and break communal spirit. These acts were not aberrations but systemic, condoned or ignored by an administration anxious to maintain control while projecting a moral facade to the international community. As the number of European men in the colony grew, reaching thousands by the mid-20th century. So did the incidence of these unions, whether fleeting encounters, prolonged concubinage, or forced assaults. Many Belgian men, stationed in rural posts with little oversight, impregnated Congolese women, producing children who embodied the forbidden crossing of racial lines. Estimates suggest thousands of such pregnancies occurred across decades, with mixed-race children numbering in the tens of thousands by the 1940s and 1950s, born primarily to African mothers and white fathers who rarely acknowledged paternity. Fathers often abandoned these women upon repatriation to Belgium or transfer elsewhere, leaving mothers to raise children alone in villages where the stigma of children of sin compounded vulnerability. The colonial ideology viewed these women not as victims, but as threats, seductresses who lured white men into moral decay or bearers of evidence that undermined the myth of racial separation. Church and state alike condemned African women in interracial relationships, portraying them as morally lax or predatory, justifying interventions that stripped them of agency. In reality, the power dynamics rendered true consent illusory. Women faced economic dependence, threats of reprisal against families, or direct violence if they resisted advances. Some relationships may have begun with mutual affection in rare cases, but the overarching context of occupation ensured exploitation. Reports from the era document widespread rape during punitive expeditions, hostage taking where women were assigned to soldiers as rewards, and enslavement, like conditions where women performed unpaid labor alongside sexual duties. This systematic violation extended beyond individual acts to institutional complicity. The force publique, the colonial army, and concessionary companies turned a blind eye, fostering impunity that persisted even after reforms following international scandals. Women suffered not only physical trauma, but social ostracism, as communities disrupted by forced labor and displacement struggled to reintegrate those marked by colonial encounters. Pregnancies from these unions brought further hardship. Mothers endured judgment from both colonial authorities and traditional structures, while bearing children who would soon become targets of state policy. The demographic growth of mixed-race offspring alarmed administrators who feared an intermediary class that could challenge the binary of colonizer and colonized, drawing parallels to revolts elsewhere. Thus, the thousands of impregnations were no mere byproduct of isolation, but a direct consequence of colonial entitlement, where African women's bodies were appropriated as part of the spoils of empire. This violence inflicted deep psychological wounds, fracturing families before they could fully form and setting the stage for the state's subsequent intervention to resolve the problem these children represented. Mothers, resilient in the face of immense adversity, clung to their infants amid growing threats, unaware that the regime's racial obsessions would soon demand an even crueler price. The legacy of this exploitation lingered in silenced stories, lost lineages, and intergenerational grief, as women navigated survival in a world upended by conquest. As the rigid racial order of Belgian colonialism solidified in the mid-20th century, the growing presence of mixed-race children, born to African mothers and European fathers, became an intolerable anomaly in the eyes of the authorities, a visible challenge to the myth of unbridgeable separation between white colonizers and black colonized. Administrators, steeped in eugenicist ideologies and fearful of an intermediary class that might undermine white prestige or spark unrest akin to historical Metis revolts elsewhere, devised a deliberate policy to eradicate this perceived threat through systematic removal. From the 1940s onward, escalating into the 1950s, colonial agents were instructed to identify these children, often as young as toddlers still nursing at their mothers' breasts, and extract them from their families under pretexts of protection or education, though in truth driven solely by their biracial origin. Mothers, who had nurtured these infants through the hardships of colonial life, faced unimaginable coercion, threats of reprisals against villages, forced recruitment of male relatives into labor gangs, or outright deception by officials promising temporary schooling only to vanish with the child forever. In countless cases documented through survivor testimonies and archival records, women resisted fiercely, clinging to their little ones amid raids. Yet the power of the state, wielded through district commissioners, police, and complicit missionaries, overwhelmed them. Children were declared wards of the state, their paternities erased even when fathers were known but unwilling to acknowledge them, falsifying records to portray them as orphans or abandoned to justify the seizure. This was no sporadic cruelty, but an organized campaign, with decrees dating back decades adapted and intensified to target thousands across the Belgian Congo, Rwanda, Burundi. Once torn away, these innocent boys and girls, estimates reached tens of thousands, were transported hundreds of kilometers to isolated institutions run predominantly by Catholic orders, funded and overseen by the colonial administration. Places like the mission at Katended in Kasai, or the Apostolinat Van Behelig family at Save in Rwanda became warehouses for the uprooted, where children arrived traumatized, crying for mothers they would never see again, labeled as Metis or Metis in derogatory registries. They were segregated not just from white society, but from their African kin, forbidden from speaking native languages, dressed in European hand-me-downs, and subjected to a curriculum designed to bleach away their heritage while instilling subservience. Conditions in these so-called orphanages were dire major rations leading to malnutrition, overcrowded dormitories rife with disease, physical punishments for rebellious behavior rooted in grief, and psychological torment from nuns who branded them children of sin, devil's offspring unworthy of family bonds. The separations inflicted immediate devastation. Mothers left in villages with empty arms, searching fruitlessly for years, some dying without reunion, children grappling with abandonment, their identities fractured before they could form. Yet the policy's cruelty peaked around independence in 1960, when panic gripped the retreating colonials fearing retribution or loss of Belgian elements. Authorities evacuated hundreds, perhaps thousands, of these older Metis to Belgium itself, scattering them into foster homes, boarding schools, or further institutions across Europe. Shipped like cargo, many arrived stateless, their paperwork altered to sever ties completely, placed under new guardians who often reinforced the erasure of their African roots. This heart-wrenching theft was executed with chilling precision. Lists compiled, transports arranged, funds allocated from colonial budgets to religious partners who implemented the ground-level abductions. Fathers, when involved, rarely intervened, abandoning offspring to preserve reputations back in Belgium. The state stepped in as surrogate, Papa Lugtat, claiming guardianship over lives it had already shattered. Survivors recount waking in strange beds, surrounded by unfamiliar faces, their cries echoing unanswered in cold halls, far from the warmth of maternal embrace. The policy not only stole childhoods, but engineered cultural genocide on a personal scale, denying these children language, lineage, and love to uphold a fading empire's racial fantasies. Mothers bore the deepest wound, their pleas ignored as empire prioritized purity over humanity, leaving generations haunted by voids no apology could fully fill. The theft of these children did not end with their physical removal. It unleashed a cascade of trauma that burrowed deep into the souls of survivors, rippling outward through families, communities, and generations yet unborn. Mothers, wrenched from the warmth of their infant's embrace, carried a grief so profound it defied language. Many described it as a living death, a hollow ache that shadowed every sunrise. In villages across the Congo, women wandered in search of vanished sons and daughters, whispering names into the wind, offering prayers to ancestors who seemed powerless against colonial might. Some succumbed to despair, their health crumbling under the weight of loss. Others channeled anguish into quiet defiance, preserving fragments of memory through stories told in hushed tones, lest the pain consume them entirely. This maternal wound, compounded by the stigma of interracial conception, isolated them further. Judged by some kin as tainted, abandoned by fathers who fled responsibility, and dismissed by authorities as unfit. For the children themselves, uprooted in infancy or early childhood, the trauma manifested as a profound dislocation of self. Arriving in sterile institutions or foreign lands, they confronted a world that rejected both halves of their heritage. Too dark for full acceptance in white Belgium, too European in appearance to blend seamlessly into African societies upon rare returns. Forbidden from speaking maternal tongues, punished for dark skin that marked them as other, they internalized shame, branded children of sin, by religious guardians who wielded doctrine as a weapon. Nightmares plagued many, visions of mothers reaching out only to dissolve into mist, cries echoing unanswered in vast dormitories. Physical abuse in orphanages, floggings, starvation rations, forced labor, scarred bodies, while psychological torment eroded trust, leaving survivors with fractured identities, unsure of where they belonged. Adulthood brought relentless questions. Who am I? Where is my mother? Why was I taken? Intergenerational pain flowed inexorably from these origins, as stolen children grew into parents who struggled to form secure attachments, haunted by abandonment fears that unconsciously shaped child rearing. Many Metis survivors recount difficulty trusting intimacy, fearing loss anew, or overprotecting their own offspring to shield them from the world's cruelty. Children of these survivors inherited unspoken sorrows, mood disorders, identity crises, a pervasive sense of rootlessness passed down like an invisible inheritance. In Belgium, scattered into adoptive families or institutions, they faced racism that echoed colonial hierarchies, slurs in schoolyards, exclusion from social circles, employment barriers that reinforced inferiority. Some suppressed African heritage to assimilate, only to confront emptiness later. Others sought reconnection, embarking on arduous journeys back to Congo, piecing together fragmented pasts through DNA tests, archival dives, or chance encounters. The trauma extended to broader communities. Villages depleted not just of labor, but of future generations, kinship networks severed, cultural transmission interrupted as languages and customs faded in institutions. Mothers' unrelenting grief affected siblings left behind, who grew up witnessing parental devastation, absorbing guilt for surviving intact. In post-independence Congo, returning Metis encountered suspicion. Viewed as outsiders tainted by colonial privilege, struggling for acceptance amid national rebuilding. Belgium society, meanwhile, largely erased these histories, fostering denial that delayed acknowledgement and compounded survivors' isolation. Elderly Metis today, many in their 70s and 80s, bear witness to enduring effects higher rates of depression, anxiety, and physical ailments linked to chronic stress, fractured family trees with missing branches, perpetual quests for belonging that span continents. This lasting legacy manifests in silenced voices, finally emerging through associations like Metis de Belgique, where survivors gather to share testimonies, demand recognition, and trace lost relatives. Documentaries, books, and legal actions have illuminated hidden sufferings, revealing how early childhood separation imprinted attachment disorders, how racial ambiguity fueled lifelong identity struggles, how unacknowledged paternity left voids no substitute could fill. Mothers who lived long enough rarely reunited, dying with unresolved longing. Those who did faced bittersweet encounters. Strangers bound by blood, yet divided by decades of imposed estrangement. The pain reverberates in descendants navigating dual heritages, confronting colonialism's ghosts in everyday racism or internal conflicts. Healing remains elusive for many, as official apologies, belated and partial, fail to restore what was irrevocably taken. The natural bond between mother and child, the uninterrupted flow of culture and love. This intergenerational wound underscores how colonial violence transcended immediate acts, embedding itself in psyches and lineages, demanding ongoing reckoning to break cycles of inherited sorrow. In the face of such profound historical injustice, the path forward demands a resolute commitment to truth, restitution, and vigilance. A collective awakening that transforms remembrance into action, ensuring that the violations endured by thousands of African women and their mixed-race children under Belgian colonial rule are not consigned to oblivion, but serve as a catalyst for healing and prevention. Acknowledgement begins with unflinching recognition. Belgium's formal apology in 2019 by then Prime Minister Charles Michel, addressing the targeted segregation and forced removals, marked a pivotal step, echoed in parliamentary resolutions and the Catholic Church's earlier contrition. Yet survivors rightly insist that words alone cannot mend fractured lives. The landmark Brussels Court of Appeal ruling in December 2024 elevated this further, declaring the systematic abductions crimes against humanity and ordering reparations of 50,000 each to 5 elderly Metis women who sued the state, overturning prior dismissals and removing statutes of limitations, opening doors for potentially thousands more to seek justice. This judicial reckoning underscores that reparations encompass not merely financial compensation but moral restoration. Facilitating access to archives, issuing delayed birth certificates, granting nationality or visas where denied, and supporting psychological care for survivors bearing decades of identity loss and trauma. True reparations extend beyond individual claims to systemic redress funding memorials, revising curricula to teach the unvarnished truths of colonialism in Belgian schools, and establishing dedicated funds for descendants grappling with inherited dislocations. Associations like Metis de Belgique and coalitions in Congo, Rwanda, and Burundi press for equitable measures, highlighting disparities where those remaining in Africa often receive less support than European residents, urging streamlined processes for family reunions, DNA tracing, and humanitarian aid. Global awareness emerges as essential, amplifying survivor testimonies through documentaries, exhibitions, and international forums, fostering dialogues that confront how colonial racial hierarchies persist in modern racism and inequality. By educating younger generations worldwide about these atrocities, societies build resilience against similar dehumanizations, whether in contemporary conflicts involving child separations or entrenched discriminations. This call to action unites us in solidarity. Governments must institutionalize reparative frameworks inspired by precedents in other post-colonial reckonings, while civil society, activists, historians, and citizens sustains pressure for full implementation. Survivors, now in their twilight years, embody unbreakable resilience, their pursuit of justice illuminating the power of voice against silence. In honoring their stories, we commit to a world where no child is stolen for the color of their skin, no mother bereft by empire's cruelty, forging bonds of empathy that transcend borders and eras. Through acknowledgement, reparations, and unyielding awareness, we dismantle the legacies of oppression, cultivating a future rooted in dignity, equity, and shared humanity.